Good morning, Grace family. Happy to be here with you on Wednesday, February 15th, 2023. It's crazy as time continues to march on how fast things seem to go. And I can't believe it's already 2023, let alone in February, in the middle of February. But here with you reading Psalm chapter 13, starting at verse 1. Let's go ahead and take a look at this psalm. Some really great stuff in it this morning. To the choir master, a psalm of David. How long, O Lord, will you forget me? Forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I take counsel in my own soul, or have sorrow in my heart all the day? How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Lighten up my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death. Lest my enemies say, I have prevailed over him. Lest my foes rejoice because I am shaken. But I have trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. Now, this psalm was very brief, but there's so much that goes on in the 6 verses that we have recorded here. And in fact, reading through it as quickly as I just did, you just don't even, there's almost like, wait, how do we go from here to here so quickly? And so I want to break this down a little bit for you. First off, obviously, chapter 13, beginning in verse 1, we have that little kind of prelude to the choir master, Psalm of David. So we know this is a Psalm of David. David starts off here with, how long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? The verb that's translated here in Hebrew is the adverbial accusative, is basically the way that you would describe it. And this is, how long will you keep on forgetting me? Will it be forever? Is it just going to be forever? Is it never going to end? Are you always going to be forgetting me? That's something I think that's interesting in how it's worded. Specifically, it seems like in this section of the psalm, David is in a period of doubt and despair. And he says, how long will you hide your face from me? The Lord is not looking upon David. David is wherever he is in whatever circumstances he is. And we'll talk about that in a moment. David has feeling like God is just not seeing him. He's not aware. And I think sometimes we get into that place where the circumstances around us, we've forgotten what God has declared, or in David's case here, we don't see a provision of God's provision, and we assume that somehow, in the midst of the circumstances that are going on in our life, that God has just forgotten that we exist, that he doesn't see. And David pleads with the Lord specifically to remember him, that David might take counsel in the Lord rather than his own soul. He says, how long must I take counsel in my soul? In the sense of he's consoling himself. Like, how long must I console myself? How long must I decide for myself and encourage myself? He would rather take counsel and encouragement from the Lord. And he feels like he's not getting that right now. In fact, sometimes counsel that comes from ourselves produces a vexation of our heart. And that's specifically what David describes. And he says, and have sorrow in my heart all the day. David expresses the sorrow stemming from his own counsel as he sees his enemies exalted over him. How long shall my enemy be exalted over me? Now, to a certain extent, why should David expect his enemies not to exalt over him? To a certain extent, we might say, well, David, why do you have a right to have your enemies exalted or brought below you and you exalted over them? And depending on when the psalm is penned, there probably would be a dependence on, if this is post his sin with Bathsheba, maybe there's some sin that's come in and now the Lord is looking away so that he can be in judgment. Or maybe this is earlier, like I believe it is. It's earlier in his life, and he's experienced a couple really big wins, and then all of a sudden he is chased out of the kingdom, constantly under a threat of Saul. And so David was anointed king of Israel by the Lord, by the hand of Samuel. And there's a long period of time before he could witness the exaltation of his kingship. And I think there's this element to which you've anointed me as king. You've said I'm your anointed one, but when is this going to take place? How long are my enemies going to be exalted before me? How long am I going to be chased around like a wild dog, like a partridge, like we talked about yesterday? And I want you to think about this, and just for a second, think back to what happens first. Tell me what if you remember here. Is David anointed king first, or does he slay Goliath first? Which happens first? Do you know? Let me show you. 1 Samuel chapter 16 is when David is anointed king. That's when Samuel goes out and anoints David as king. Because God and Saul are done. In fact, God sends a spirit to torment Saul directly after that. Then look what happens next. David and Goliath. Now, I don't think we realized that when. Sorry about all the Greek conjugations that came up. David and Goliath come up pretty quickly after David is anointed, but David was anointed before this happened. And so David probably had this period of exaltation where he slays the giant. I'm sure he became a big deal. In fact, later on, we see even in Samuel, as we're going down through the story, it's interesting to see that David kind of ends up becoming a big friend with Jonathan. Saul becomes a little bit, David goes to war, but then Saul ultimately becomes jealous of David. So he tries to, get him to marry his daughter. That's what happens here. And then after that, we see that there's more circumstances that ultimately that starts off with Saul trying to kill David. And so from this time forward, there's a long history of David just running for his life, and many years before David is officially set up as king. So might be a long time before his enemy's exalted, before he's exalted over his enemy, and his enemies are exalted over him. So verse 3 says, "Consider and answer me, O Lord my God. Light up my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death." It's plea at the core here, the lightening of his eyes. If we were to go through all the scriptures and use the places where we see lightening of the eyes, this is like to give encouragement, to refreshment of the soul and of the body. And so the idea being that David be completely refreshed. Right now, he is probably tired. He's probably worn. That's why I think it's him in the time where he's in the mountains and he's fleeing his life. I think that's why, because ultimately, as we're looking at here, he is just so exhausted. He feels like he's just going to sleep the sleep of death. He's going to be given over into death, just due to exhaustion. And then he says, if that was to occur, my enemies would say, I have prevailed over him, lest my foes rejoice because I'm shaken. And so there's this element, which is these people that are against them, they just want to see David brought to nothing. And that's exactly what's going on here. And he's saying, consider and answer me, O Lord. You've been hiding from me. You've forgotten me. You've left me. You've forgotten me here. And here's what's going on. And you've said you've anointed me. What's going on? And that's where I think that's where David's at. That's where David's at. David's brought to the point where he's like, my foes would rejoice in my shaken state. And David knows this is not the Lord's desire for him. That's not what the Lord wants. So why are you forgetting me? Why are you hiding your face from me? Notice verse 5. But I have trusted in your steadfast love. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. What's changed? Nothing. Nothing's changed between verse 4 and 5. And that's what's so odd about it. Is he prays to the Lord and he says, consider and answer me. And then he leads himself to trust in his steadfast love. He says, my heart will rejoice in your salvation. He trusts that God will perform what he has promised and that he will not forget him forever, even though in this moment it feels like God has and God will. He says, I will sing to the Lord because he's dealt bountifully with me. He thinks about the things that God has previously done. This is why, again, you got David and Goliath situation. He's dealt bountifully with me. There's, he has a good friend, Jonathan, and then he marries Michal. All of this. David says, you've dealt bountifully with me. I know that I will rejoice in your salvation. You will bring it to pass, the things that you have said. So David forgets what he feels and clings to what he knows about the character of God. And that's the hard thing, but that's what we've got to do as Christians. But this is very common. Doubt is normal. Doubt is very normal, even in the life of the believers. I mean, think about the disciples. They get into the boat. They're with Jesus, and there's all of a sudden this great storm that's arising, and they wake Jesus up, verse 25 of Matthew chapter 8, and they say, "Lord, we're perishing. Save us." He says to them, "Why are you afraid, O you of little faith?" He demonstrates who he is. Have faith. But doubt is normal for us. Doubt is normal for us. John chapter 20, I think this is a very interesting story. Jesus comes to Thomas after Thomas has said in verse 25, unless I see his hands, in his hands, the mark of the nails, and place my finger in the mark of his nails, and place my hand in his side, I will never believe. That's just not even, that's even more than a little bit of doubt. It's probably just downright arrogance that, unless I see it, I won't believe it. And then verse 27, Jesus' response to him, he says, "Put your finger here, see my hands. Put out your hand, place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe." And then Thomas says, "My Lord and my God." And Jesus says to him, "Have you believed because you've seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed." See, when these doubts arise, and they're going to arise, and they're going to raise themselves up in our heart, we need to recognize those feelings of doubt. We need to accept that we feel doubt and not panic about it. Some of the things that we do sometimes is we start panicking about, well, why am I doubting? Why do I feel this way? Or whatever. And that causes more conflict than if we just accepted, in this moment, I am having a lack of faith. And, crying out to the Lord like the man who was told, if you have faith to believe, he will be healed. And he says, "Lord, help my unbelief." That's where we need to be. That's where we need to be. Then, like David did, we tell ourselves about who God is and what he has promised. And from there, we believe what God has said about himself and about what he's going to do. That means that you and me need to know what God has promised concerning us. And one of those things that I cling to on a daily basis is that he who started a good work in you is faithful to bring it to completion on the last day. And those are the things that I hold in my mind in the midst of difficulty. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. And I'll be sure to be back here tomorrow with Psalms chapter 14. The fool says in their heart, there is no God. And how do we respond to that? God bless you all. Have a great Wednesday. See you tonight. If you're going to be here for Hosea, we're going to do Hosea at the church. We're going to from 6:30 to 8. So if you'd like to come out, we're going to be looking at Hosea chapter end of 9 into chapter 10. God bless you all. Take care.